welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. I'm Kim Menninger, and I am so grateful that you are here. It's now been more than a year since I started this podcast, and I can't tell you how much I've learned and grown from the conversations that we've had here. As you may have heard me share, I have struggled with imposter syndrome and anxiety for much of my life, so this is a very personal journey for me. I do this podcast because I want us to share our stories with each other and to stop suffering in silence. Imposter syndrome is a pretty universal human experience and nothing we should be ashamed of. By listening to or supporting this podcast, you're helping me to advance my mission of destigmatizing this conversation and making it safe for everyone to be vulnerable and get the support they need. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support this mission even further, please consider subscribing. And if you feel inclined to leave a 5-star review, this really does help raise the visibility of the podcast so that others can find us. And please consider sharing with your friends. Lastly, if you have a story you'd like to share, connect with me anytime. I would be happy to interview you. Thanks again for being here. Welcome, Melody. I can't tell you how excited I am to actually see you right now. I've been following your work for a long time. I'm a big fan, and I knew when I started reading your articles and things that you post, and then most recently your book, that we have very similar views on the world and the people that we support. And so I'm super excited for us to be able to chat about that today in the context of imposter syndrome. But before we do that, I would love to invite you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Melody Wilding. I am the author of Trust Yourself, Stop Overthinking, and Channel Your Emotions for Success at Work. My background is as a licensed social worker. So before becoming a coach, I was a therapist. And so my coaching approach very much incorporates managing your own thoughts and emotions to be more successful. And now I've been coaching for over 10 years, and I work with high performers who primarily struggle with imposter syndrome, and also teach human behavior at the graduate level at a university here in New York.
Oh, that's great. And I can't wait to talk a little bit more about what you see out there and the people that you're working with and some of the concepts that you talk about in your book. But I also want to ask you a little bit of a more personal question and just ask you a bit about what imposter syndrome means to you and how, if at all, it has shown up in your own life or in your own work.
To me, imposter syndrome is really a lack of confidence and a sense of insecurity that holds you back from your full potential. It is really, to me, kind of this habitual thought pattern of not feeling good enough that then guides your actions, where you question your work or the value of the ideas you have. And it becomes this sort of self-reinforcing negative cycle. At least that's how I've seen it be for me. And in the book, I really talk about in the introduction a story of where I was really struggling with imposter syndrome, but also burnout, and really just the collection of challenges that comes along with imposter syndrome, and how that sense of insecurity and never being enough had driven me to overachieve and overextend myself to such a degree in my career that it led me to a really severe burnout where I was having heart palpitations, my hair was falling out, and it was really just guiding all of my actions and a lot of people pleasing, perfectionism, all of that. And so that was a major wake-up call for me. And of course, I've come a very long way, and luckily having a therapeutic background as I do, had the tools to pick myself out of that. But, even now, flash forward over 10 years later, and I still have major moments of imposter syndrome because I'm an overachiever. I am always pushing myself to do more, be better. I hold myself to a very high standard of excellence. So even now, if I'm putting out a new article, I wonder, what are people going to think of this? And is it valuable? And people have said this before, maybe I shouldn't share this. And so those moments still come up. And to me, imposter syndrome is many times a sign that you are moving towards something that challenges you and that is meaningful to you. So I've really been able to reframe my relationship with it from something that becomes so damaging and self-destructive to something I can work with. It can be present, but it doesn't have to drive all of my actions.
I love the way you say that, because I do think of imposter syndrome as something that's not going to ever really go away, right? It's not something that we're going to cure per se, but having the recognition of the role that it plays and having the tools available when it does show up, I think is what we're striving for here, right? And I love that you're sharing very candidly that even as a therapist who understands this really well and who works with people on it, that you're still experiencing it too. And that's really one of the main purposes of this podcast too, is to normalize this. So many of us feel this way. And unfortunately, too many of us think we're the only ones. So
I know I did until I heard the term, and it was like major light bulb went off. And for one of the first times in my life, realized, oh, I'm not broken or weak. This is a very real thing that people are just silent about. So many people are struggling with this, but no one is talking about it. And it's been great to see, of course, resources and podcasts like yours that are starting to bring that to the forefront, because it is very isolating.
Exactly. And I want to shift gears for just a moment, because I want you to describe what you mean by sensitive striver, because that is such a great term. And I think it captures so well my experience. So I'd love for you to share with listeners what that means to you and kind of how you got there.
A sensitive striver is someone who is both highly sensitive, meaning they think and feel everything more deeply, and who is also high achieving. So they expect a lot from themselves, put a lot of pressure on themselves to succeed. So this combination of traits, tremendous asset, leads you to be empathetic, emotionally intelligent. You're very perceptive and observant. At the same time, processing so deeply and really sensing other people's emotions, being aware of that can, in terms of my own experience, what I find with my clients and having done this for a decade is that it amplifies a sense of imposter syndrome. Because we're taking in so much more information, we're so much more vigilant of our surroundings. So we're paying attention to people's behavior and their body language. How does my boss respond when I share that idea in a meeting? And what does it mean that he looked down instead of keeping his gaze on me? We read into all of that and create deeper meaning from those situations. And as people who are more sensitive, sensitivity fundamentally refers to having a more highly attuned central nervous system. So there is about 20% of the population that has this genetic trait difference. What scientists are finding is that it's related to a connection of different gene variants that leads to the brain processing certain neurochemicals, things like dopamine, serotonin, differently. So parts of the brain that are related to depth of processing, thoughts, the emotions of yourself and other people light up more than in the other 80% of the population. So sensitive strivers, when it comes to imposter syndrome, tend to have more intense responses, more intense emotionality or fear or panic when those emotions of feeling like you're not good enough or you have no idea what you're doing set in. So you may be more likely to freeze under pressure, for example, because you're just sort of caught off guard and so overstimulated in that moment that you just kind of play dead, almost like an animal caught a deer in headlights, so to speak. So that is why sensitive strivers in particular struggle with imposter syndrome much more acutely than others.
And so I remember the first time I heard you say that or read that you said that. And I remember feeling like, wow, she really gets me, which was really powerful to me, because I think I've always thought of that as a negative thing, right? Like it's something that sometimes I joke, it's like, I wish I didn't see things the way that I do, or I wish I could be like somebody else who just doesn't notice, who doesn't have that kind of awareness, right? But I like the way you frame it as having great value as well. And I want that, I really want everybody who's listening to take that away from it too, right? Because there's always a shadow side to everything that we do well, but this is really a strength. This is something that's a real differentiator for those of us who identify this way.
100%. And, so many of us, especially women, grow up with that narrative of why you take everything so personally? Stop being so sensitive. So we're conditioned to think that being this way is wrong and something that you should get rid of. And when we get into the workplace, of course, we start hearing, stop being so emotional about everything, take the emotions out of it, when in actuality, your emotions, that ability to sense and perceive and anticipate, is what makes so many of my clients really effective at negotiations, persuasion, boosting morale on their team. I can't tell you during the pandemic how the managers and the leaders that I worked with had such higher retention and satisfaction rates on their team, because guess what? They cared. They were listening. They were the one who saw a team member was, not really as engaged on calls and would reach out and say, hey, what's going on? And get that person on a plan to adjust their assignments if they had a lot of, childcare demands going on, for example. So it's a tremendous asset from the emotional standpoint, but also in the way that our minds work. Because as sensitive people, as you were saying, we have a heightened awareness. We spot gaps. We see opportunities before other people tend to get there, because we're synthesizing things so much more deeply. And so I often hear from clients, they'll say, well, I didn't feel comfortable sharing my idea because no one else had mentioned it yet. So that must mean it wasn't a good idea. And I always reframe that for them, because as someone who's more sensitive, you're a few steps ahead and you tend to be more innovative. You tend to be putting those pieces together. Or I see this a lot with people who may come from a different background than maybe some of their other peers and colleagues. And they feel self-conscious because of that. They feel like an outsider. But once you realize, oh, my background actually contributes to having a very unique angle to the problems we're trying to solve, it can start to reframe and help boost your confidence around speaking up and sharing those things.
Oh, it's so powerful. And I know you share a lot of great strategies in your book, but I'm wondering if you can share a little bit now, because what you're saying too about the emotion piece is really, I think, important, and something that comes up a lot in the conversation that I have as well is this idea that, especially for women who work in traditionally male-dominated environments or structures where you are told to take the emotion out of it, knowing that we can't ever take the emotion out of it, but especially as people who feel more deeply than other people, how do you think about emotion in the workplace? Like, what are some of the things that you can actively do if you know that you tend to be more emotional, and you also know that that's something that may be frowned upon, or you might be getting pressure to tone it down a bit in the workplace?
Yeah. I always like to come from the frame of focusing on emotion regulation, which is the fact that we accept that our emotions are normal. We're going to have them, but we have power and control over how we react to them and express them. And the key here is making sure that we feel proud about how we're showing up, because what tends to be most problematic with heightened emotionality is that we don't feel good about how we're showing up. And I'll often have clients who come to me and say, I am afraid of getting a bigger position because I crumble under feedback. I just start crying and I can't have that. And so they won't get a higher level position because of that. And so we work together to give them tools to emotionally regulate more effectively, so that in those scenarios, they're not necessarily responding in a male way or a stoic way, but they're responding in a way that makes them feel proud. And sometimes that may mean tears if the situation is important enough that you need to express that, for example. So emotion regulation is really about, how do I show up in integrity in a way that is going to make me feel good about it? And fundamentally, I talk about this in the book, that emotions are energy in your body. And we often try to process our feelings intellectually instead of physiologically. And particularly for sensitive people, that can be a mistake because we have such a heightened nervous system response, a heightened visceral response to what's happening, that if we don't get our bodies under control, we'll have no access to our minds. And so in the book, I talk a lot about the idea of grounding and really having practices that help you manage and disperse your own energy so that you're not bringing that reactiveness into situations and you can approach them with a clearer head. And so grounding can look like a short meditation. It can look like some controlled breathing. For example, I really like something called box breathing, which is breathing in for a 4 count, holding it for a 4 count, breathing out for a 4 count, holding it on the out for a 4 count. And so all of these sorts of grounding activities, what they do is activate your parasympathetic nervous system. So the opposite of your stress response. So they help calm you and they take you out of that fight or flight response where you may react, you may lash out, you may say something you don't mean, you may feel like you can't control your emotions and that they're getting the better of you. And so when we're able to channel that energy more effectively, we're able to show up with greater command over ourselves.
I think that's so helpful too, just having some form of practice that you can use to manage that physiological response when it shows up. Because I always say that to the women that I talk to too, who say it's as if I can no longer form a coherent thought when I'm in a meeting or something. They're not losing IQ points, right? There's something physiological that's happening there. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, let's imagine for a moment that we either didn't have those tools available to us, or it was a particularly emotional situation and we showed up in a way that we didn't want to. Mm-hmm. And we cried, like the horror, right? Like this, yes. Everyone's so afraid of this, right? What can you do afterwards? Do you have suggestions for how to manage that after it's already happened, either within your own mind or even maybe publicly, how to handle it?
I do. Well, actually, let's go to during, because I think that's important too. Because sometimes you start having, the tears start coming on and you just feel that welling up in your chest. And when that happens, often, again, as women, and when we have imposter syndrome and a lack of confidence, we're so apologetic about it. We're like, I'm sorry. Oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. And we undermine ourselves instead of being, firm and steady in saying something like, as you can see, I'm having an emotional reaction to this because what we're talking about is really meaningful and it's important to me. And so thank you for giving me the space to have this reaction, this conversation. Like I said, it's important and I want to continue, rather than crumbling and you being apologetic about it, because that signals to the other person that, oh, what's happening is wrong and shouldn't be happening. So that's number one. Then afterwards, I think as a factor in imposter syndrome is perfectionism. And we often think that if one bad thing happens, that's it. We've missed our chance. We blew it. How could we do that? This confirms we have no idea what we're doing, rather than realizing it's not so all or nothing. Yes, you may have not showed up in the best way possible, but you can deliver a strong follow-up and come back with different ideas after you've had the chance to think about it and say, in that meeting, yes, I did get a little emotional. I've had the chance to think about what you shared, and here's some ideas I had that I wanted to share about that. So the follow-up is what matters, and the aggregate of your behavior is what matters, not these singular instances that we get so attached to.
I think that's really great too, because I do like what you're saying about the apologizing piece and really making ourselves even more vulnerable or undermining ourselves further in that situation, to simply own it, right? That's what I always encourage people to do is, if you find yourself in that situation, just own it, and people will respond to how you're handling it, right? Yes. Oftentimes, like you said, if they're finding it inappropriate, it's because you've signaled to them that it's inappropriate, not that it truly is. So I think that's really great advice. I want to think about another emotion for a moment, which is fear. right? And you talk about fear versus intuition. And I think the intuition piece is really powerful, especially given what we're talking about of just being particularly sensitive. And I know from personal experience that I tend to be pretty intuitive as a human, but I'm also somebody who, when the anxiety ratchets up, I can't hear my intuition anymore, or just I feel so much clutter in my brain that I can't get access to it in the way that I know it would serve me. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, and it's a fine line for many people between intuition and fear, because intuition's like a muscle. And so many of us have not been prompted to cultivate or strengthen that muscle, to listen to ourselves. We've been so conditioned to look outside ourselves and be aware of the expectations and living into the expectations that other people have of us. So intuition versus fear. Maybe I can talk a little bit about the difference first, and then how to tap more into intuition. So fear tends to be, we were talking about physiology. And again, this is where going back into your body and what your nervous system is signaling to you matters. Fear tends to feel very constricting. It tends to feel like in your body, almost smallness or very closed, as if your shoulders are hunching over. It can feel very tight, like it's binding you. Whereas intuition tends to feel more relaxed, open, like you are receiving. Intuition also tends to be very urgent, fear tends to thrive on urgency. Like this needs to be done now. You're not doing enough. People are getting ahead of you. Whereas intuition tends to be more slow and compassionate. Fear tends to be very critical, of course, and intuition tends to be very kind. And so when I work with clients, I often liken intuition a bit to an internal traffic light. Is intuition flashing red, saying that you shouldn't go into this situation? This is not going to be for my best benefit. Is it saying slow down, maybe take more time to consider that choice? Or is it giving you the green light to say go? And really figuring out what intuition feels like for you and your body. It feels a little different for everyone. Some people feel it more in their chest, others in their gut, literally. So even if you can think back on times in your career or your life when you followed your intuition, what were the type of things you were thinking and feeling versus times when you made a decision based on fear? What was different about that? What were you thinking and feeling then?
I think that's a really great way to think about it too, because in the moment, we're not often checking in with ourselves in that way, right? We're just operating, and it's really helpful to look back and reflect on that of who was driving, right? That decision, and what does that tell us about ourselves and how we might want to show up differently going forward.
Yeah. And I find what's really helpful with imposter syndrome in particular is the question, what will my future self thank me for? Because most of us, we can connect with that better, wiser version of ourselves in the future that we want to do good by, right? And if we can access that better self and ask, what would they want me to do? Or what decision would make them happy and proud? That can clear some of the imposter syndrome out of the way.
I like that a lot too. And I tend to think about it in terms of, which is probably more of a negative spin on it, but more about what you're going to regret more.
Exactly.
Right? But I like the more positive version that you're providing here. What will my future self thank me for? That's great. One of the other things that always stands out to me when I read your work is the boundaries piece. And this is something that is so incredibly challenging for so many of the women that I work with. And I think it's got to be tied, right? It's got to be tied into everything that we're talking about. There's a people pleasing element to it. I'm not confident enough that I have the right to set a boundary here. It's so complicated. I would love to hear more of your thoughts on that too.
It's very complicated because for the most part, especially sensitive strivers, we're naturally kind, we're helpful people, and we get a lot of joy from making that sort of impact or a difference for others. And so, yeah, it's a fine line between wanting to be helpful versus being taken advantage of. And it comes down to motivation for many of us. And that's where intuition comes back in, is why are you doing this? Are you doing this because you genuinely, authentically, it's a heck yeah for you in your gut? Or are you doing this because you want to avoid some sort of shame, punishment, ridicule? You want to avoid someone disliking you. And many times with imposter syndrome, we don't say no because we don't want to fall behind other people. So we'll just say yes to all of the assignments to prove that we're adding value. And so in the book, I talk about using emotions as a guide for figuring out where you need to set boundaries. And the most telling of those emotions is resentment. The feeling of resentment, indignation, bitterness towards a person or a situation is a very good sign that you need to set a limit. So many of us have been in the situation where you agreed to help out a colleague and they say, oh, it's just going to be a few weeks on this assignment. We're shorthanded. Flash forward and it's a few months and you're still doing that. And every time you sit in one of those meetings or you see an email about it come through your inbox, you just get that feeling deep down inside. And that's a very good sign that you need to say no, set some boundaries. So really using your emotions as a signal in that way can give you very valuable data.
Sorry, I've got a needy cat in the background here who's trying to get my attention. So one thing that I'm curious about there is, and I don't want to oversimplify this, but is there a first step that you can provide, like offer in terms of for people who really struggle with boundaries and it does feel so hard for so many of the reasons that we're talking about? Is there a first step that you would suggest if I really want to establish stronger boundaries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, taking stock of those situations where you feel an outsized sense of resentment or frustration, for example, tension, and really just looking at that list and gathering them and then figuring out from there, where do I need to take action, is often a very good place to start. But even before that, I think there's a mindset shift that needs to happen. As you were talking about, that we need to feel like we have the right to say no. Because for so many of us, we don't even think that's an option. We, again, equate it with people aren't going to like us. And so starting to shift your mindset to realize that actually saying no now is better than going through with something and not giving your full attention or your full heart to it. Because wouldn't you want someone to say no to you up front rather than kind of dragging themselves through something? And every time you say yes to something you don't want to, you are saying no to something else, whether that's your own self-care, it's another project, it's your family, for example. And so you really have to weigh the cost versus reward.
I like that a lot too. And I know myself, and it's not something I'm proud of, but I've certainly found myself in that type of a situation where I felt taken advantage of because I didn't set a boundary. And then I do get that sense of resentment and that sense of like, how dare you ask me to do this, right? When I have basically given them permission to ask me to do that. And so one of the things that I've found helpful to think about too, because I am somebody who's driven by wanting to make people happy and wanting to maintain harmony, is to also think proactively of what's the right thing for the relationship. And if I go down this path, this relationship is important to me, and I go down this path knowing that this isn't the right thing for me, this isn't, like you said, going to be good for either one of us. It's certainly not going to be good for our relationship. So that can help me too, just not feel like it's all about me, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Considering what's the cost to the other person too is very helpful.
Yeah. Anything else that you see out there that you think is important that we haven't talked about yet?
Let's see. We touched on some of the most important things, boundaries. I think it might be helpful to talk a little bit about self-talk since so much of imposter syndrome is driven by negative self-talk.
Yes.
And one of my favorite strategies for that is naming that voice of imposter syndrome, giving it a moniker, personifying it as something silly or more lighthearted. For example, I call my inner critic Bozo. You could call yours Cruella de Vil, Voldemort, whatever you want, the Gremlin, whatever works for you. But the key here is to create some distance to separate yourself from that voice so that you're not so fused with it and don't automatically react from a place of believing that negative self-talk and trusting your thoughts are true and reality, that you're able to step back, sort of say, I see you, Bozo, and you can have a seat, but you're not going to drive the ship here today. So that's very helpful, as is, I don't think we can have a conversation about imposter syndrome without talking about celebrating your successes, because what's so deep in imposter syndrome is not being able to internalize your strengths and what you're good at. And I see this with clients all the time, that they will attach to the one piece of negative feedback someone had about their presentation and disregard all of the positive things that came in. They just can't take that in. And so having a practice that allows you to reflect on, place your attention on those wins. And side note here, that a win is not defined as something, major, you earn the company $1 million. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, I had a hard conversation today. I did something uncomfortable. I responded to a situation differently than I would have a month ago. Whatever those small moments are, taking 5 minutes at the end of your day to reflect on what those are. I call it a brag file. You can call it a smile file, whatever works for you. But that intentionality and attention on that progress over time, this isn't going to be overnight, but over time starts to shift that tendency to just disregard all the good and only take in the bad.
I love that too. I am a big proponent of writing things down, really taking the time to celebrate or mark the end of something. I think whether it's the way we were conditioned or just the world that we live in that's so fast paced and always on to the next, we don't take enough time to just stop and appreciate how hard something was, or that we stepped outside of our comfort zone, that we did something scary. All of that is so important. And so one of the themes that I'm hearing in everything that you're saying is just space for reflection, right? Just to just slow down a little bit so that we're not always in reflexive mode, but to just think, listen, be present in some of these moments. And I think that's something that isn't necessarily easy, but something that we'd really benefit from paying attention to.
Yes, well said. Creating that space and more of that slowness, that as a person who is more sensitive, that is the place where you are at your best.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am going to encourage everybody to read your book, because what I love about it is how practical it is, right? We're talking about concepts that are, can feel a little bit abstract, a little bit hard to take action on, but you really do a nice job of making it easy to ask. You've given us the cheat sheets for the questions to ask and the things to think about. So I think it's a really, really useful tool that I'm going to be recommending going forward. Is there anything else that you want people to take away from this conversation today?
I think my biggest take-home message is that your sensitivity and your ambition, when channeled correctly, can be your biggest superpower. So use them to the fullest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melody. I'm going to include your information, links to the book and everything in the show notes if anybody wants to connect with you. And I'm just so grateful that we had this opportunity to chat.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for listening. If you'd like to stay connected, please join the Leading Women discussion group, which meets every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. This is a place where women come together to discuss questions or challenges related to leadership development and career management. It's a great place to learn from, support, and connect with other women on similar journeys. In addition to the weekly calls, we also have a Facebook group and a Slack channel where we stay connected and support each other. Please join us there too. You can check out the show notes for the links. Before we wrap up, If you like this podcast, I would love to share another podcast with you that I know you will enjoy. Do you ever find yourself playing small? Do you want to take risks, but in the end, you end up taking the safe route? Does your inner critic keep you from reaching your full potential? As counterintuitive as it often feels, we don't become confident first and then take action. It's through our actions that we build our confidence. That's why one of the greatest ways to manage imposter syndrome is by taking brave and bold action. If you want inspiration and insights to help you to take action and to be brave at work, then my friend and colleague Jen Pastikas's Brave Women at Work podcast is for you. Jen and I met when we interviewed each other for our podcasts, and I knew instantly that Jen and I shared a similar worldview and a commitment to empowering women to be our best selves. On her podcast, Jen digs into common challenges such as perfectionism, boundary setting, and burnout, all to empower us to shift our mindsets and play bigger in the workplace. You can find the Brave Women at Work podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Visit the show notes for the relevant links. Thanks again, and please stay in touch.